but he wasn't necessarily like the smartest politician to ever cross the presidency. And an example of that is the fact that he promised he would only run for one term, and he'd only be president for 4 years, which came back to kind of bite him a little bit. He had a 4-point program, first of which was to reduce the tariff rate, and he did that with the Secretary of the Treasury, who was named Robert Walker. And they lowered the tariff down to a rate of 25%. It was called the Walker Tariff of 1846. Now, tariffs restrict goods coming into the country. They can be protectionist because if you buy something from England, it's going to have a 36% tax on it effectively just to get it into the country. And so your American-made products end up being cheaper than your foreign-made product. However, at this time, there is no income tax, and one of the only ways that Congress can make money is through a tariff. So by lowering the tariff rate, more stuff came into the country from overseas, and Congress made a lot of money off of it. Polk also wanted to restore the independent treasury. He wanted to get rid of the bank again, just like his political forefather Andrew Jackson had done. He wanted to settle the Oregon dispute, and he wanted to acquire California. Now, there was a big argument. One of the Democratic campaign slogans of 1844 was 54-40 or fight. 54-40 we talked about yesterday in the last lecture was the line for the very northernmost part of Oregon, which is in present-day Canada, right on the line between Alaska and Canada. Polk had no intention of insisting on that 54-40 as being the line that we would settle for. He wanted to settle for 49 degrees, which was pretty much the rest of the Canadian border. So it'd be kind of silly to try to take all the way up to 54-40 if we had settled for 49 for the rest of it. What had happened in the 30 some odd years that this area had been joint occupied by the British and by the Americans is that more and more American settlers came into the Oregon country, and they outnumbered the British quite a bit. So in 1846, the British came around and accepted that 49-degree line of compromise. There were Democrats who shouted, 54-40 or fight. Why all of Texas and not all of Oregon? Was another question that was asked, and quite bluntly, quite frankly, the answer came from Senator Thomas Benton of Missouri, that Great Britain is powerful and Mexico is weak. So despite all the campaign bluster, Polk got neither the 54-40 or a fight. He did get something that was in the long run much better, a reasonable compromise without a rifle being raised. Once again, 1844, the United States probably could not have gone to war with Great Britain. Great Britain was at its maximum. It was reaching its maximum era of world superiority. And it would have been interesting, don't get me wrong, it would have been interesting, but we probably wouldn't have stood very much of a chance of a global war with Great Britain over Oregon, of all places. Here is President Polk, business up front, party in the back. He's got the mullet going on. He was the 11th President of the United States, and for your reference, I have included the Mr. Beat presidential elections in U.S. history, election of 1844, in the links for this video. And here is the map for the Oregon Controversy. It was this area right here that the British were mostly concerned with keeping. Right here. Um, this was the disputed area. But as more and more Americans came into this area, and this area too, as more and more Americans uh, filled up this area, it became less and less likely that the British would have claim to it, and so they compromised with this line right here. And they got to keep Vancouver Island. Another part of Polk's agenda was to get California. California was like a pearl sitting out there on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. It had been neglected by Spain and Mexico for about 300 years and was very sparsely populated with Spaniards and Mexicans until the early 1700s when they finally started taking an interest in California. The Bay of San Francisco was the most coveted spot of California because it would be our future gateway to the Pacific Ocean. If America was going to be from sea to shining sea, you needed a good port to be able to open up the west coast to the rest of the world. In 1845, the population of California was mixed with about 13,000 Spanish Mexicans, 75,000 Indians who were, claimed as citizens of California, and transplanted Yankees. So Americans who had gone west already and set up trading posts in California, who had either gone by wagon, which is highly unlikely, but most likely they went by ship down under the coast of, under the tip of South America and up the coast to California and set up shop. Polk didn't want to go to war with Mexico over California. They wanted to buy California more than anything else. He was eager to buy it. Part of the reason is that if Mexico wasn't really going to do anything with it, Polk and the United States feared that Mexico would either sell it to another country, or more likely that Mexico would go into debt and be invaded by one of its debtors or one of its countries that it was indebted to, like Britain or France, and that then Britain or France would have control of California and spurn the United States. So Polk was eager to get California before any other country did. Relations with Mexico City embittered mostly over the issue of Texas, because remember, Texas is now part of the United States. There were boundary questions about United States territory versus Mexican territory along the Texas border. Where exactly did Texas end? Mexico claimed it ended at the Nueces River. The United States claimed that it ended at the Rio Grande. There were all these swirling questions about Texas, and that's what kept negotiations down from California. But Polk was eager to pay for California. Here we go, the rumors that circulated that Britain was about to buy or seize California. We know from history that eventually France does end up invading Mexico. So if we hadn't gotten Mexico to, if we hadn't gotten California in 1846, 1847, France could have ended up with it. So Polk sends a man named John Slidell to Mexico City as its minister in late 1845, and he was instructed to offer a maximum of $25 million for California and the territory to the east. Mexico would not permit Slidell to present his insulting proposition. So Slidell gets to Mexico City. He's not even allowed to propose such a thing. So it goes nowhere. So now Polk prepares for a showdown. You remember, I just told you that there was disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. And so we already had troops, the United States already had soldiers stationed just outside of Corpus Christi, Texas. And so in January of 1846, he orders 4,000 men under General Zachary Taylor to march south to the Rio Grande, right there in that disputed territory. Not just like on the other side of the Nueces River, but a whole nother 75, 80 miles south into the disputed territory, right on the border of the Rio Grande. So Mexico sees this as an attack. They see this as a threat that these American soldiers are in the land that they claim as being part of Mexico. And on April 25th, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and attacked General Taylor's army, his 4,000 men. It doesn't go too well for the Mexican army. By this point, if the Mexican army had been going against American troops 10 years before, during the time of the Texas Revolution, they would have stood a pretty good chance of defeating the American army. But by this point, the Americans had moved to a different rifle system than the Mexicans. The Mexicans were still using flintlock rifles, and the Americans had moved to a percussion-based system, so it was more reliable and negotiably faster to reload, and it had fewer misfires. Also, the American artillery was faster and lighter than the Mexican artillery, and they were able to flank the Mexicans several different times during Palo Alto. But as soon as word gets back, like word is rushed back to Washington that the Mexicans had attacked General Taylor. And so Polk sends a war message to Congress asking for Congress to declare war against Mexico. That hostilities were forced by the shedding of American blood on American soil. So we're still going with the claim that this happened on American soil. There's no talk about it being disputed soil. That this happened on American soil on our side of the Rio Grande. Here's a famous picture of the American troops going into combat against the Mexicans, and they're advancing right on the Mexican artillery line. If you look right here, this is a map of the theater of operations for the beginning of the war. And you'll see here that this is the road up to Corpus Christi. This is the Gulf of Mexico right here. This is Padre Island. Any of you college partiers right here, this is Padre Island right here. And down here is the Rio Grande. There is no Brownsville yet. So Brownsville would be down in this area now. And here's Matamoros. The Mexican army crosses over Matamoros to Palo Alto. They're defeated at Palo Alto. They're pushed back to Resca de las Palmas. And they are pushed back again across into the Rio Grande, Mexican side of the Rio Grande. So Congress overwhelmingly voted to go to war, but a question remained: did Polk actually provoke the war? California was an imperative point in Polk's program. Mexico wouldn't sell California at any price, and so the only way to get California was to use force or to wait for an internal American revolt. But both sides, Mexico and the United States, were spoiling for a fight. Like, we didn't put troops on the Mexican side of the border. We just put them into the no man's land between the two countries. Mexico engaged the attack. Mexico put their soldiers into conflict with the American soldiers. We may have baited them, but Mexico wanted to take back Texas. They wanted to prove that they were a world player. Doesn't go well for them. Polk wanted California, not war. Polk wanted to fight on a limited scale and then pull out when he captured the prize, but the conflict itself would not be so simple. In 1846, we also turned our attention to the Southwest and California. So while war breaks out in Texas, General Stephen Kearny is sent down into the Southwest from Fort Leavenworth, and he goes down and he captures Santa Fe and most of New Mexico by August and December of 1846. And then he goes west to California. While in California, there was another American military officer named John C. Fremont, who, with American naval officers and local Americans, hoisted a banner of the California Bear Flag Republic. If you look at the California state flag today, it still has the bear on it from the Bear Flag Republic. So they mount a revolution, a quote-unquote revolution within the territory of California and declare it independent from Mexico, while Mexico can't fight back because they're fighting a war against the United States inside of Mexico. General Zachary Taylor then spearheaded the main thrust. He pushed his soldiers over the Rio Grande and fought his way into Mexico. Eventually, in February of 1847, he has one of the biggest battles of the war, the Battle of Buena Vista, against the man himself, Generalissimo Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the man who had led the Mexican army against the Texans in the Texas Revolution. He's back in power of Mexico, and he leads the Mexican army against the Americans at Buena Vista and is defeated, surprisingly. He actually had the superior hand at Buena Vista, but Taylor was able to push him back. And it's a multiple-pronged attack of Mexico because another main expedition is being led by General Winfield Scott. And Scott brings his troops down the Mexican coast and lands them at Veracruz, and then fights through the jungle all the way up to Mexico City and captures it in September of 1847. This is one of the most brilliant campaigns in American history. It's still studied today by the war colleges around the world. This basically three-pronged attack against Mexico, a classic divide and conquer strategy. Here's the same map that's on your page 277 in your book, but here's what I was talking about. You have Kearny coming down, taking New Mexico and going west. Fremont taking the same route but going westward to California. And here they basically give California the chance to break up and become its own republic, breaking off from Mexico. And then, of course, the United States would annex California shortly thereafter. And then down here in Mexico, you have General Taylor's troops coming here to Buena Vista. You have Scott's troops coming up from Veracruz and taking Mexico City. And it's done. The war's over at that point. Polk was anxious to end the shooting as soon as possible, so as soon as Mexico was in the clutches of the United States Army, Instead of pushing the army further to take all of Mexico, Polk sends a State Department official down to Mexico. Actually, he follows Scott's invading army so they can start negotiations as soon as Scott captures Mexico City. And in February of 1848, Trist signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that gives Texas formally to the United States. It gives up all the Mexican claims to Texas. It gives the United States all of the area stretching northward to Oregon and west to the ocean, including California, and amounts to about 1/2 of all Mexican land. It's quite a big crush for Mexico. In return, we, the United States, agreed to pay $15 million for the land. So, on one side, Mexico would have really benefited quite a bit if they had taken the $25 million deal just for California and the land to the east of it. Instead, they had to fight a war, and they only got $15 million for it. There was even though Congress voted to go to war, there was a rather vocal conscience wing of the Whigs who denounced the war, and they were very public in denouncing the war. They came to control the House in 1847, and they threatened to vote down supplies for the armies in the field because they saw it as a damnable war, as a war that we didn't need to be in. And then there was another group of people in the United States, expansionists, who were all for the war and wanted to see the United States take all of Mexico, make all of Mexico part of the United States, all the way down into Central America. So you have these two groups kind of fighting it out, and you can kind of guess as to which side they lean on when it comes to slavery versus anti-slavery. The Whigs were starting to become more and more vocal against slavery, and of course the Southern expansionists wanted more slave land for the South. The treaty was approved by the Senate. There were opponents who wanted all of Mexico and opponents who wanted none of it, and both sides condemned the treaty as being immoral. Here's a picture from the book on page 278. The newfangled telegraph kept the nation closely informed of events in far-off Mexico. This is one of those pieces of technology that I wish I was in class to show y'all. I would bring a telegraph key in and try to type out a message for you. Not only that, you have steamships that are able to take news fast, but the telegraph, as long as you had a wire linking two places together, the news could travel as fast as that electricity would flow, which is, electricity goes at about the speed of light, and then you have resistance in the line, but still, it's pretty darn quick. Here's another picture. This is from the Makers of America section of the book. And this is about the Californians, or the Californios, as it says in the book. And here's a dance of native Californians at the San Francisco de Assisi mission. And the 60 years that they operated, the 21 California missions became a combination of churches, towns, schools, farms, factories, and prisons. And so if you want to know a little bit more about the natives of California, and this picture from 1816, it's on page 279 in your book. So overall, the Mexican War was a really small one. It's going to be small in comparison to the other wars we fight in, with the exception of the Spanish-American War in 1898. America's total expense, already vast, was in. America's total land, which was already vast, was increased by about 1/3 if you include Texas. The land that we got from this war was even bigger than that of the Louisiana Purchase. A sharp stimulus was given to the spirit of manifest destiny, and the proverb has it that the appetite comes with eating. 13,000 Americans lost their lives in this war, but that was mostly by disease. The fighting didn't do too much to them. And also, probably the biggest. I don't know if this is a premonition type thing or if it's telling in any way, but the Mexican War was the schoolroom of the Civil War. And what that means is that a lot of your great officers in the Civil War were junior officers in the Mexican War. They were lieutenants and captains in the Mexican War. And so the campaigns of the Mexican War provided field experience. The military academy at West Point was founded, and the Naval Academy at Annapolis was established. It says here that the Marine Corps came into existence, and the Marine Corps already existed, but it kind of came into being again because of this war, and this time it stayed in existence. War was fought without defeat and without a major blunder. Captain Robert E. Lee served in this war. Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant served in this war. West Point was established in 1802 to fully justified its existence through its well-trained officers. The Army waged its war without defeat and without a major blunder, despite formidable obstacles and half a dozen or so achingly large marches. Chagrined British critics as well as other foreign skeptics reluctantly revised upward their estimate of Yankee military prowess. The Mexicans, although poorly led, they fought heroically. The one particular place at the Chapultepec Castle outside of Mexico City, which is their military training academy, there was nothing but teenage boys there, and every single one of them died defending Mexico City at the Battle of Chapultepec Castle. Something close to 100 or 200 or so boys, and they're revered to this day in Mexico as Los Niños, very reverentially. Here's some portraits from the war. The man on the left is Ulysses S. Grant from the time of the Mexican War, and on the right is Robert E. Lee, and they will be meeting each other again in about 15 years. One thing about the Mexican War is that Mexicans have never forgotten that their enemy tore away half of their country. This war is a marked point, an ugly turning point in relations between the United States and Latin America as a whole. And this is one of the things that I wrote my not my grad school thesis on, but this was part of several papers that I wrote in grad school about how a lot of the problems we have with Latin America today directly relate to this time period, and through the media and impressions of Mexico and Latin America, and all the way up to our current drug policies between the cartels and the United States relates to this time period. The war also re-aroused issues about slavery. The conscience Whigs They saw this war as being an opportunity to expand the slaveocracy of the South, and they were opposed to it. In 1846, just as the war was beginning, just as war was declared, Polk requested $2 million from Congress to be put forward as a peace agreement between the United States and Mexico. A representative from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, introduced an amendment to that money. He feared that the Southern slaveocracy introduced. He feared the Southern slaveocracy, and so he introduced an amendment to that budget that stipulated that slavery should never exist in any of the territory wrestled from Mexico. So that amendment gets added to the money, but it never becomes law. But it symbolized the issue of slavery in the territories. Now, if you remember, the Missouri Compromise guaranteed that slavery could extend westward. But at that time, they only thought of the Louisiana Purchase. I don't think that anybody really saw that the, Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and those states would be added to the United States so quickly. So there's still that question of slavery about will slavery move into New Mexico? Will slavery move into Arizona, Nevada, and most importantly, the pearl of the West Coast, California? Polk leaves the country. He leaves the presidency. He leaves the nation with a splendid physical heritage of California and the Southwest, but also the ugly moral heritage of the embittered slavery dispute. As Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, Mexico will poison us. So that's the end of the presentation. Let me go back into my software here. So I hope you enjoyed it. That's the end of this chapter. Next week we will do 2 chapters because we have to get back on track. We'll be doing chapter 18, which is renewing the sectional struggle. And we will be doing chapter 19, which is drifting towards disunion. Now, I will let you know that you have some assignments due soon. You have this week's assignments, which is the quiz that I gave you for this week over chapter 16. You have the sorry, my screen's doing something weird here. You have the notes you have the quiz that's due on Saturday. You have the questions for this chapter that's due Saturday. You have the questions about Belle Grove, which is due on Saturday. Your next test will be over chapters 16, 17, and 18, and it will be due on April 25th. Let me pull up my calendar here. So this Saturday is the let's see here. This Saturday you just have assignments due. Next Saturday, I forgot that I had to restart my computer, so everything's lagging now. Okay. All right. Okay. So on April 25th, which is 2 weeks from now, effectively 2 weeks from now, you have your next major grade due. which is chapter 16 through 18. And you have your historical book review due. These are non-negotiables. These items are due. You've known about them all semester. I'm still going through the grading of your last one, so I need to pick up the pace on that. And then your last test will be a final exam, and it will be on May 12th. Is when it's due. I'll have it available for 3 or 4 days before that, but it's due on Tuesday, May 12th, which is a change from your original syllabus. This is something that the junior college had to put in place because of all the different classes that were changing around. So I'll open up the test on Sunday, May, I guess that'd be the 9th, and it will be due on May 12th. So you only have like a 3-day window to take that test. Both of these tests will be short answer. Not one sentence, but it'll be 3 to 4 sentences long, short answers. But I haven't made the final yet. I want to remind you all that these weekly assignments that you're doing for this class, that's where your questions are coming from for your next test. So make sure you're doing these and you're doing them correctly, because that's your study chance. I hope you're doing well. Wash your hands and stay safe. And I will see y'all later. Bye.